now on to section 2 of Kernell and Jacobson's chapter 2, The Logic of American Politics. And just like the previous lecture, I'm going to actually talk to you and you can see me here. So bear with me because I may accidentally move the, like right now, screen. And I can't see myself, so I don't know what faces I'm making. Yeah. All right, now, so we're, like I said, we're on to chapter 2, or section 2, rather, in chapter 2, and we're going to talk about the 1787 Constitution. And the next 3 sections of this chapter, we're going to go pretty fast, because there are some parts of it all of it's really important, but there are some parts of it that it's just not going to behoove you to listen to me read slides off for you. So in that vein, I want to kind of give you a caveat for how to approach this next chapter and basically how to approach the Constitution in general. There is this weird idea among some people that, that the founders were amazing and the founders were, and that we should, listen to how they created the U.S. Constitution and all of this. But I guess I just wanted to speak to that a little bit because the founders aren't flawless. I mean, there were people. There were people who wanted to create a new government that had the kind of authority needed to govern properly. Now, while they weren't flawless, a lot of them were not good people. But they were really smart. And so I just wanted you to keep in mind a couple of things. Because like I said, sometimes we think of these founders as these amazing men who, were so smart, created the U.S. Constitution, and can you believe it? It was perfect. But, that wasn't the case at all. While they were really smart, let's continue. Now, first, the Constitution is a culmination of compromise. Compromise after compromise after compromise after compromise, etc., etc., etc. Now, it's important to note that a lot of individuals got what they wanted from this new form of government. There were a lot of delegates at the convention, and some of them got what they wanted. Nobody got everything they wanted. Many of them got nothing they wanted. Many of them still hated it. Many of them thought that it's not perfect, but it's the least of the evils. But the bottom line is to remember that this is the product of compromise. And so the final document wasn't what any of them envisioned. Okay? Now, that leads us to the second bullet point here, where I note that the Constitution is not a perfect document, and the founders knew it. I don't know who said this, but there's a saying that I've always heard, and some people look at me weird when I say it, but compromise means that everybody loses. And that's usually not what you hear. Usually you hear, well, compromise is good. And yeah, it is good. A lot of times compromise means that, everybody gets a little bit of what they want. And actually that is what compromise is. But it also means that people don't get what they want. Not exactly, at least a little. So in that case, I guess the old saying is right, that compromise means that everybody loses at least something. Now that said, the founders knew that the document was not perfect, but they understood the trade-offs they had to make to create an institution that would work and facilitate the collective action that the articles just couldn't provide. Now, they didn't like the idea of a central government with a lot of power, but still, they knew they had to give it some power in order for the government to do its job. In their mind, they would have a central government with zero authority. But they knew that some of the institutional processes would create problems. And it would, however, even though they knew some of the processes within the Constitution was going to create problems, they also understood that it would stop other maybe worse problems from rising up. So they were kind of trading off. But, do we want this problem or this problem? Is this problem easier to deal with, or is this one easier to live with? Basically, just remember what I said in the previous lecture. Every policy choice, every institutional choice, every process, procedure, everything has trade-offs. And they knew it, right, whenever they were creating this government institution that we call the United States of America. Third, they understood how hard it was to write a constitution because they had done it before with the Articles of Confederation, and they knew how hard it was. Yeah, so they knew that they couldn't anticipate every single problem that the nation would face down the road, so they added in a way to amend it. Now, for an institution, it's very, very important that it be stable. So when they created a way to amend the Constitution, they wanted to make sure that if the Constitution was amended, that the nation was really, 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 really sure that they wanted to amend it, and that it wouldn't be a situation of tyranny of the majority. So when we look at how the Constitution's amended, there's a lot of what we refer to as supermajoritarian components to it, where it's not just about getting a majority, because if a majority gets what they want, then there may be as many as 49% of individuals who don't get what they want. If a plurality gets what they want, then it may be, well, it could be as many as like 70 or 80% that still don't get what they want. So what they wanted was a supermajority, understanding that nobody would be perfectly happy with every single policy, but if they could prevent tyranny of the majority at least a little bit by making the amendment process more difficult, then that's the way it should be. So it's important that institutions be stable, and that's what they were thinking with the amendment. So they knew it wouldn't be perfect, and that the Constitution would be amending, but not so easily amended that it would, collapse at a group of individuals' whims. And then fourth and finally, so I said the founders were smart. A lot of the ideas, actually most of the ideas that were put in the Constitution weren't the founders' ideas. So when we talk about, this great document, sometimes I guess historians and political scientists are really referring to just this institutional document, the Constitution, that is a smorgasbord. That's not the right word, but you know what I mean. Like it's a compilation. That's way better and more academic. A compilation of all of these really, really wise political philosophers. The founders studied what really, really wise people and people that actually understood what made good government said was good government. Now, so that's not to say again that they didn't come up with some novel ideas. For example, the bicameral that represents citizens and the states, the Senate and the House. That was clutch. It saved the convention, but they didn't come up with even half of these ideas on their own. They looked at John Locke. They looked at Plato. They looked at Montesquieu. They looked at all of these political philosophers of the past. So let's look at the philosophical principles that really influenced what the founders wanted out of this government. The most prominent influencer of the Constitution was John Locke. John Locke was a political philosopher that introduced the idea of this first bullet point, which is popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty it absolutely embodies the idea that government works for the people. Power is derived from the people, and that is a tenet of American government, right? Citizens are the ones with the authority and the power, and they have the authority to imbue that power to government officials. So citizens choose via election or via at least, surrogate sort of, how, when, and with whom or to whom to delegate their authority. So Locke is where they got the idea of the power belongs to the people, popular sovereignty, but not direct democracy. The founders really hated direct democracy. But they also hated tyranny. So they're looking for something in the middle. We'll get to what we are, which is a republic. Moving on. Now, one of the interesting things that your authors point out, and we'll talk about these philosophies more as we go through the book, but they also drew from Sir Isaac Newton when they were talking about or trying to think about creating laws that govern social relations. What they wanted to do was so Sir Isaac Newton influenced them by demonstrating the necessity for a balance of power within government and between governments and the people. Okay, so we'll talk more about this later, like I said, but the founders used the concepts of balance and force to not try to shape individuals who took office, but to use human nature so that, because listen, the founders understood, and so did political philosophers, they understood that the institution had to be able to withstand good leaders, bad leaders, would-be despots, or people that were, I guess, too weak to lead. And they would, and it could happen that somebody would be elected that was just simply not a good person. And they couldn't depend on the idea that, they couldn't depend on the sentiment that, maybe whoever gets elected to office would be a really good person and they would only pursue the interests of the common good. Now, because of that, like I said, they tried to use balance and force to shape the individuals, not to shape the individuals who took office, but they wanted to use human nature to benefit good government. Like with checks and balances within government. So, and like I said, we'll talk more about this, but in other words, don't expect individuals not to act self-interested or to behave how they should behave. Instead, what they did was they created an institution that would force or incentivize them to, or incentivize their behaviors to result in what would be the common good. So change the institution or create an institution that would funnel that self-interest that they would have, the bad tendencies to strive for more power, and to funnel that into a way that would end up being the common good for everybody. All right, so after Newton, one of the other, probably after Locke, Locke is the biggest influence, then probably Montesquieu. Of course, Newton was in there, but they weren't overt with his philosophies. But Montesquieu is who the founders got the idea of a republic from. They saw that government was better if it was limited in size and scope. That if freedom and liberty was something that we wanted to strive for, then couldn't give the government too much power, and that it wasn't good for individuals to depend entirely on the government, nor was it necessary. And by depend on the government, I mean to just govern every area of their lives. Now, so Montesquieu's idea was not, here's what government should be, that's it. Montesquieu's idea, and the ideas of the founders were, was that as time went along, perhaps government would expand. But it would only expand insofar as it was necessary, to regulate what was needed and to create the right kind of society, right? So government should only go as far as it takes for the government to do its job, no further. Okay, so Montesquieu gave us the idea of a republic, and then David Hume, gave the founders the idea, kind of like Sir Isaac Newton, where they look at people and they say, you know what, we can't stop people who aren't good people from being elected. We can't. But what we can do is try to use that nature, that human nature that people have to compete for power and to want power and to strive for power, all of that. They wanted to use that desire for power to create an institution that uses that desire for government's advantage, which ultimately would be for the people's advantage. And so this is where we get the idea of separation of powers. Now, the goal of this section, this slide right here, is to introduce these philosophical influences to you, so that as we look at these separation of powers, checks and balances in more detail, limited government, things like that, that you would be able to look back and say, oh, I definitely see how, what the founders were thinking. So, so let's move on to the next slide, because we've got a lot to cover. Let's go back. All right, so now we're at the Philadelphia Convention, or the Constitutional Convention. And as I mentioned before, James Madison comes in with this idea of this new form of government. And it wasn't an idea necessarily, it was written down on a piece of paper. It was a full-fledged plan. Now, his plan was called the Virginia Plan. And there was one component of it that caused the biggest stir in the Constitutional Convention than anything else. This issue that the Virginia Plan ignited was so big that the convention almost collapsed from this issue. And the issue was, how would they structure the legislature? How would representation be created, or rather, created? So in Madison's plan, he wanted a very strong legislature. He wanted a plural executive chosen by the legislature, and the lower branch of people, and a lower branch that was chosen by the people based on population. An upper branch would be chosen by the lower branch. So he wanted bicameral legislature, meaning there would be two chambers, which is what there is today, the Senate and the House. But the people chose who was in the House, and their allotment was based on their population, would be based on population. And then that lower chamber, chosen by the people, would elect an upper chamber, which kind of would be the Senate. And the Supreme Court would be chosen by the legislature. Very powerful legislature. Now, at first glance, this may seem like a good idea. You think that if you believe in popular sovereignty, and as Americans, that's one of our tenets, well then, giving the people the power in this way is good. Giving the Congress, the legislature, this tremendous amount of power, also good, because that power is being derived directly from the people. However, Virginia was a really large state, very populous, and that means that big states, populated states like Virginia, would have a ton of people in the House of Representatives, or rather the lower branch. They didn't call it the House. So the lower branch would be made up with mostly a majority of people from a few states. Virginia, I think New York, yeah. This didn't sit well with those who were from small states. I mean, this is actually a picture of the plan here. All right, so moving forward. Now, small states like New Jersey, and when I say small, I mean states that weren't heavily populated, got really upset because they saw the amount of power that the legislature would have. They saw that the legislature would be primarily composed of these larger states, and the larger states would then just drown out the desires of these smaller states. So they said, this can't happen. So here's what New Jersey, they said, okay, let's forget about the Virginia plan, and they proposed their own plan, the New Jersey plan. Now, the New Jersey plan was a continuation of the Articles, right? So, kind of. It was, and I want to note here that they weren't saying, hey, let's just amend the Articles. Everybody by this point was, whether they wanted to or not, they were on board with Madison's plan of just doing away with the Articles. But part of the New Jersey plan was to, let's take this from the Articles. Let's do one vote per state. Okay, that way no state had more power over another state. Yes, Congress needs to be strengthened. Good. There would be a plural executive, meaning not just one president, but many. And it would be like a council. And then the Supreme Court would be appointed by that plural executive. Virginia didn't like that either. So we had, Virginia was, and you know, easy for Virginia to say. They were saying, but popular sovereignty, and whoever's in the legislature needs to mirror the people. And so if there are a lot of Virginians, and there needs to be a lot of Virginians there, but then I see New Jersey's point. New Jersey's point that they would just simply get drowned out. This is one of the complaints, actually, when we talk about reforming, when people talk about reforming the Electoral College, then you might find presidents not really worried about what people from Wyoming might think, or what people from Kansas might think, or Iowa might think, and presidents may just focus on the states that have a lot of people that vote, or are really heavily populated. So anyway, it's a little similar. Now, this issue was so big, And again, your book talks about this in more detail, but this is like the key big thing in the convention, this New Jersey Virginia plan. And like I said, it almost broke up the convention. People almost went home. They were really upset. But Roger Sherman from Connecticut came up with an idea that would use both the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan, and we call that one or two things. We refer to that as the Connecticut Compromise or the Great Compromise. But I think your book refers to this as the Great Compromise throughout it. So the Connecticut Compromise or the Great Compromise said, all right, let's take the best of both. Bicameral, yes, we like that. But the lower chamber would be the House of Representatives, apportioned by the number of free inhabitants. And then plus, later on, 3/5 slaves would be equal to 3/5 of a person, known as the 3/5 Compromise. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then the Senate would be chosen by the state legislatures. Yep, not by us, individuals, but by the state legislature. So your book has this great layout here that kind of highlights the Great Compromise, the New Jersey plan, the Virginia plan. And you can tell that when you look at the Constitution, you can tell that the legislature is by far the most important component of it. And to be honest, it still is to this day. We talk about the authority that the president has. The president has very little authority, really. Primarily because if the president does anything without the legislature, then first of all, it's limited to begin with. It's executive orders. We'll talk about that when we get to the chapter on the executive. But the president can't do anything without Congress. And if he or she does, then it can be undone by the next president. When W. Bush came into office, he undid, but then continued on some of the plans and policies that Bill Clinton put in place. When President Obama went into office, he carried on and canceled some of the executive orders that Bush put in place. Then when President Trump got into office, we see him carrying on with or stopping some of the things that President Obama put forward through the executive order. So anyway, now and today, the most powerful branch is still the legislature. So anyway, it's the star of the Constitution, it's the star of the convention right now, and it's the only thing that was so contested at the convention that delegates just almost threw their arms up and said, I give up. We're going to come back to the Great Compromise later in another chapter, namely the chapter on the legislative branch. But let's move on because we need to keep going. All right, now, let's talk about the components of the 1787 Constitution. All right, before we do that, I want to throw out some ideas here. When we look at the theories behind the constitutional framework, there's some terms that you'll need to be familiar with, some things that were really important ideas that the founders had whenever they were building this Constitution. And the first thing is they wanted a federal system. Now there is an entire chapter, next chapter, dedicated to federalism. Federalism is a phenomenal idea. I get really excited about it. I love the idea of having dual sovereignty between the federal government or the national government and the states. And it seems to work really well when done correctly. So a federal system, that's one part of it. This is where you have constitutional powers and functions that are shared by states and the national level of government. Now, some things aren't shared. The national government has the power to command the army, but taxation, shared. And I completely can't think of anything else, but a lot of other things are shared too, and we'll talk about it next chapter. The Supremacy Clause, I'm going to actually give you that. There's a slide here in this presentation that actually highlights it, so I'm going to wait on that except to say that this says that if there are two laws that contradict the state or the federal law, and both were within their sphere of making laws, the state and the federal government, that the federal government wins. So So while the federal system says there's no hierarchy between the state and federal government, that's right, no hierarchy. They're equal, states, national government. Um, the Constitution does give us guidelines on, well, what happens if the two conflict? Well, the Constitution wins out, the US Constitution. Then we have the idea of separation of powers and checks and balances. Separation of powers meaning that when we look at the three branches of government, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branch, they all have equal authority. Now, I just said the legislative is the most powerful branch. Well, a lot of stuff gets done there, but the legislature can't do anything without the executive. And the Supreme Court can't do anything without the executive and the legislative branch. And the executive can't do anything without the legislative branch. And I mean, they all need each other. So there is no hierarchy between the branches of government. Their powers are separated. And they are constitutionally equal to and independent of each other. Now, this makes it necessary for the branches to cooperate. At least the fact that all of them have what we see here in the fourth bullet point, checks and balances. Now, checks are placed on each branch to prevent any single branch of obtaining too much power. The legislative branch can pass laws. The president cannot do that, but the president can veto laws. The president can't veto every law that, or is not necessarily the final say either. The Congress can override that veto. And now we see the Supreme Court here has checks with both, the executive branch and the legislative branch, because the Supreme Court is made up of individuals that were appointed by the president but confirmed by the Senate, and Congress itself makes, or rather forms and adjusts what the lower courts look like underneath the Supreme Court. So all of them are kind of tied. They're constitutionally equal, but they're tied to each other in some way to prevent one branch from just taking over. So I want to say one thing about checks and balances. So some of you, I hear a lot of this election term where we hear this is the most important election that we will face as a nation, and the stakes have never been higher. But these are two things that should ease your mind a little bit. One, the stakes. I mean, they have arguably been as high or even higher. I mean, think about what happened after the Civil War. That election was extraordinarily important. There were other important elections right at the beginning of the nation's history that would have kind of changed the trajectory of the nation. However, we as a nation, because of how our Constitution is created, we don't, for lack of a better phrase, we don't live or die by one particular person who's elected. So the nation doesn't survive or die based on the election of one person, whether it be in the legislature, whether it be the president, whether it be a Supreme Court nominee, right? One person is not going to be the demise of the nation because of the checks and balances that are in place. So that should hopefully ease your mind a little bit about, it's really easy, and it's I guess somewhat good to get really invested in the election. And yes, you should vote for the person that you think could do the best job, but we have a really stable system. And I'm not saying that there's not going to be terrible bumps. The Civil War was a pretty big bump, right? I mean, there was also a time when we forget about John Adams and him instituting the Alien and Sedition Act, where you couldn't say anything negative about the federal government or you would be put in jail, right? That happened in the early 1800s. Or when Andrew Jackson was president. That guy was something else. Andrew Jackson, the Trail of Tears. Anyway, so the nation's been through a lot, and the institution, while not perfect, has been able to withstand a lot. And by withstand, I mean the nation hasn't fallen yet. So anyway, that being said, let's move on. Now, your authors go through how the founders designed the legislative branch, how they designed the executive branch, how they designed the judicial branch. And I don't want to go into too much detail here because, well, we're going to have a chapter on each of these, Article 1, 2, and 3. A couple of things, though, that I want to make sure that you consider as you read through here. With the legislative branch, two really big components of that article, Article 1, make a special note about the Commerce Clause and the Necessary and Proper Clause. It's also known as the Elastic Clause. So highlight those in your book. That's going to come up again and again and again and again and again and again. All right. The executive branch, I'll say this. Remember just 5 minutes ago. Now, when we talked about the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan, the big thing at the convention was, as Kanye West said, no one man should have all that power. So they really wanted not just one president, but several executives. The idea being that they wouldn't get a tyrant in place, that they would have a group of people. Now, eventually, they decided that having multiple presidents would not be a good idea, that really it would just allow them all to deflect whose fault was what at any given time, right? So, oh, well, yeah, we did that, but it wasn't me. I didn't want to do what the other president did or the other executive council did, all of that. So the idea was kind of a balance then in the executive branch. Excuse me, I'm going to shift here. Yes, there would be one president, but there would be a limited scope of presidential responsibilities. Now, just like you highlighted the Commerce Clause and the Necessary and Proper Clause from the previous slide, highlight the Take Care Clause. The president has very little specified authority, and the authority that the president does have, if you look actually at the Constitution, they're tied to somebody else. But now, we do know this. Well, we do know. The Constitution says that the executive power is vested in the president, in the executive, and that the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Now, we've interpreted that as the president having the authority to create the federal bureaucracy. And so who is at the top of the EPA? Who's at the top of the DOE, the Department of Energy, the Department of Commerce, the Department of Agriculture, all of these cabinets and agencies within the government? The president is at the top. But the president does have veto authority on legislation. So anyway, and then for the judicial branch, the only thing I would note, at least right now, would be that they were supposed to be the umpire between state and federal institutions, or state and national institutions. I use the term federal and national interchangeably, so I'm going to try to at least make a note when I do that. So basically, we have a federal system, federalism, which means that the states are sovereign and the national government is sovereign. They're on the same level. There's no hierarchy there, which sounds weird, I know, but it's true. There is technically no hierarchy. So what if they conflict? Who's the referee? Who's the umpire? It's the Supreme Court. And of course, the Supreme Court will always say, well, then there's a supremacy clause. But not everything is as clear cut, so I've got to power up. Not everything is clear cut, so sometimes the Supreme Court has to do some more digging, so to speak. Oh, I forgot to, yeah, there you go. There's the judicial branch. So here we see a nice little graphic where you can see the branches are equal, but they have checks, right? So what one branch can do, another branch has to kind of okay or has a say in. Now, throughout, I need to go saying now so much, but throughout this chapter, I mean, this chapter is kind of broad because we're looking at the Constitution as a document on the whole. How do we get there? What does it mean? All of that. And the rest of the semester is going to be looking at the different components of the institution that the Constitution made up. However, there are a few substantive issues that your authors wanted to point out that really took up some time when deliberating among the delegates in the Constitutional Convention. One being foreign policy, right? So foreign policy, only national government. Another being interstate commerce. Interstate, so there are two terms here that you're going to have to get straight. So I'm gonna show those to you now. The two terms are interstate and intrastate. Intrastate refers to goings on within the boundaries of the states. States have the power to regulate commerce within their state, so interstate, or intrastate. Do you see what I mean? Anyway, just when you're writing, pay attention. Intrastate, interstate. States can manage what happens within their boundaries, but when it comes to states handling issues with other states, they can't discriminate or be in competition with other states, not to the extent that they were in under the Articles of Confederation. Okay? And then finally, slavery. Slavery was a substantive issue, and they talked about it a lot. A lot of the founders did not want slavery. One of them being Rufus King. Rufus King, when he went to the convention and found that they were going to throw out the articles and create a new institution, he supported in all of his writings the necessity of doing away with this barbaric institution. And a lot of other people were in his, they were basically on his side. However, slavery was still a big part of the South and some people in the North too. So here's what we had. We had an issue here where we see people like Rufus King decided to trade off. And here's what I mean. Southern states, and it was mostly Southern states, wanted to count slaves as part of their population in order to get more representatives in the House. Now it was odd because they didn't give the citizens any rights in the states, but they wanted them still to count. They wanted more representation in the House. Ultimately, the decision was to allow states to count a slave as 3/5 of a citizen. So this is where we get 3/5 compromise. How did this happen and why did this happen? For this reason. New England, many of the people in New England didn't want slavery, but they weren't willing to give up the Constitution, as it were, in order to abolish slavery. So they struck a bargain. There were other issues that New England wanted. New England wanted a lot of concessions commercially. And the South said, okay, how about this? You give us what we want, and we'll give you what you want. So what happened here was essentially, as you can see, log rolling. Standard bargaining strategy. Two sides swap support for dissimilar policies, and you end up going with the one that's most important to you. All right. Now, that'll come up again later on, but let's move on for the sake of time to amend the Constitution. Now, amending the Constitution is supposed to be not easy, but it's not supposed to be impossible. It's important that amending the Constitution not just be something that the majority wants, but something that the supermajority of the nation wants. So amending the Constitution should not be taken lightly, and because of that, there are many fail-safes in place to make sure that an amendment that would harm the nation or harm individuals within it would not get passed. Unfortunately, that also means that sometimes really good amendments take a long time to get passed. So you've got a transaction cost versus conformity cost here. If you allow amendments to be too easily passed, you could risk having a really bad amendment that would hurt people coming through. Like I said, there's a big transaction cost. You make it difficult to amend the Constitution. You might have to wait a long time, a couple of years, 2 years, 3 years. for the amendment that you want to come through. Now, there are two ways to propose an amendment. The states can do it by 2/3 of the states getting together and say we propose this amendment, or 2/3 of both houses of Congress can agree to an amendment to propose. But it's not done there. That's just the proposal. Then the amendment has to be ratified. The amendment is ratified by the people. So 3/4 of the states, it can be either the state legislatures or it can be done with a state convention, must ratify the amendment, which is them accepting the amendment. The Constitution has been amended 27 times, and we'll talk more about the amendments when we get into civil liberties. But when we look at proposing amendments, they're at the top bullet point. Either 2/3 of Congress will do it or 2/3 of the states holding a state convention. We've had a state convention one time where they have proposed an amendment to the Constitution, and that convention was the Philadelphia Convention. And so you can understand why everybody's been a little reticent to call another state constitutional convention, because they're afraid that, well, the government might get overthrown again and we might have a new form of government out of it, because that's what happened in Philadelphia. Okay. I urge you to look at figure 2.3 here. That goes through the processes of the amending the Constitution. All right, now this next slide, I have kind of a breakdown of the important parts of the U.S. Constitution. In addition to that, I've posted on Blackboard my own, I call it the Professor Davis abbreviated version or abridged version of the U.S. Constitution. So you can kind of get like a very rough idea of what's in there. Now, I've broken this down into the parts that I think is kind of the important, like, kind of headliner for each of the articles: legislative, executive, judicial. The relations between state and federal government is Article 4. That's where we are guaranteed a republic form of government. Amending the Constitution, Supremacy Clause, and then terms for which the Constitution will go into effect. Now let me pull over and stop about this one for a second. The terms the Constitution will go into effect. What did it take? It would take 9 states to ratify the U.S. Constitution, the 1787 Constitution that was presented. But a lot of those states were really reticent to ratify this new Constitution. Because remember, the delegates at the Constitutional Convention, or the Philadelphia Convention, were only intended to amend the articles. A lot of the states were still really mad that it ended up like this. And so, anyway, I guess there were 2 things that the founders were thinking here. One, unanimous consent is very, very difficult to get. I mean, that's just like number 1 in collective action. And the larger the number that you're trying to, convince for unanimous consent, the harder it is. That's why they said, we don't need all 13 states. We need 9 of the states in order to make this our governing document. And it still wasn't that easy. As a matter of fact, they had to really do a lot of convincing. In the end, the last state to ratify the 1787 Constitution was Rhode Island. And Rhode Island ended up ratifying the Constitution because they were bullied into it. Rhode Island thought they would be fine on their own. And they were next to open waters, like right there next to the Atlantic Ocean. They had their own economy. They thought that they would just be an autonomous group. They didn't want to join in the Constitution. They were still super, super gun shy about this new central authority that would have a lot of power that they weren't really happy about. Now, to be fair, Rhode Island didn't send any delegates to the convention. They boycotted it. So they really didn't have a say in it either, because they purposely did not take a seat at the table. After a while, the federal government, or rather the national government, kept saying, Rhode Island, you need to join, you need to join, you need to join. And then finally they said, you know what, Rhode Island, if you're not going to join, that's fine. We're going to treat you like a foreign nation. So they did. And they started imposing tariffs and taxes on Rhode Island whenever Rhode Island tried to trade with other states. and they treated them like a foreign nation. Rhode Island couldn't afford it. So Rhode Island consented and said, fine, you win. We are a part of the Union now. All right. So, sorry about that pause. All right. So there are several institutional design tools, like a little institutional design toolkit that the founders used whenever they were creating the Constitution. Among those were the power to command. For example, the president having the authority to command the troops. Necessary, right? Because it provides a person or a group with the ability to bypass collective action problems when collective action problems, or when collective action will actually negatively impact us. Here's what I mean. Think about what would have happened if, Pearl Harbor. All right, so Pearl Harbor is bombed by the Japanese, and what if the president couldn't do anything unless he went through Congress? I mean, Congress has to declare war, yes, but the president has the power to command the armed forces. And so they recognize that there are some instances where it was necessary to give a position the authority to command. Veto power was also something that they used, and it kind of speaks for itself. And we all know what the veto is, which is saying no to a piece of legislation. And it provides the ability for, whether it be Congress or, whether it be the president, to preserve the status quo, which sometimes is okay. Agenda control, so deciding what should be decided on in order to help coordination. We see agenda control within the House and the Senate, kind of deciding, okay, what are the things we're going to take up? Like, what are the things that are important to this nation? And agenda control is one way that you can, is one tool used whenever you're trying to design an institution to shape the behavior of the individuals within it. Moving on, voting rules. Voting rules was also, all of this was important, but I'm going to keep saying, oh, this was really important. This was really important. Well, voting rules are important too. And listen closely to this, okay? Because this is going to come up again and again too. Voting rules were important because of what amount did it take in order for action to take place. So here's what I mean. Throughout the Constitution, you see instances where it calls for majority rule, plurality rule, supermajority rule. Majority rule is 50% plus 1. So majority rule is that if 50% agree, or 51% agree, or 50.2 agree, then you're good to go on some policy choice, on some institutional choice. But it also means, like I said, that 49% will be very unhappy and will not get what they want. It can lead to tyranny of the majority, and like I said, there's a high conformity cost there because there might be a lot of people who aren't within the majority. Plurality winner also, or the plurality rule, also has a high conformity cost. Now, this is the idea that it's not about receiving a certain amount of votes. It's about receiving the most votes, but not necessarily a majority. So let's say that we're voting for 3 choices, and one choice gets 40%, and the other choices get 30% each. That equals 100%. Yeah. So the 40% choice wins under plurality rule, but that means that 60% also not happy. So really high conformity cost. Now, supermajority rule, which is what we look at, the Senate is the supermajoritarian institution, requires 2/3 of the people to agree in order for a vote to be passed, or something to be done, or an action to be taken. Very low conformity cost, but really high transaction cost. And when people talk about the Senate, this is one of their biggest complaints, that it's too high of a transaction cost. It takes too long for anything to get done. But if they went to a majority rule, that could lead to tyranny of the majority. So you see what I mean about institutional trade-offs? So what we have here then is that when you look at the institutions that were created by our founders, we see kind of a confluence of some things that take a majority rule, some things that take a plurality rule, some things take a supermajoritarian rule. And when you think about, well, who are the kind of people that like majority rule, plurality rule, supermajority rule? Honestly, all kinds of people. You can't even break it down by political party. Political party likes the kind of voting rules that would allow the political party to win. And sometimes for the political party to win, that may mean that they really want supermajority rule. But if the if the voting rules aren't in the favor of whatever political party, they're obviously going to really oppose that voting rule. So what matters is to political parties, to people, to groups that are declaring their opinions about certain voting rules, people get mad whenever they're not on the winning side. And so whichever side you're on kind of at any particular point in time kind of determines which one you're in favor of. The last institutional design tool was delegation, which, when we look at the national government and the state governments together, it's just a ton of delegation. We as citizens delegate, we authorize someone to make decisions for us. There's a principal, those who have the decision-making authority, that's us, and then there's the agents. That's those that we send to Washington, D.C. on our behalf. And those who exercise decision-making on our behalf of the principals are us. So let's move on. Yeah. Within the Constitution, you're going to find 3 different types of power, and I will use these words throughout the remainder of the semester. So in these, I always put these definitions on an exam. Enumerated powers, concurrent powers, and implied powers are all of the types of powers within the U.S. Constitution, and some of them are more concrete than others. The enumerated powers are the most concrete. There's no arguing with them. There are specific powers that are given to federal government, to the national government, that are expressly stated. For example, Article 1 says that Congress, the legislative branch, has the power to coin money. Nobody can argue with that. The states can't go in and say, hey, now wait a minute, that can be interpreted differently. No, this is very much enumerated. They have the power of the U.S. Mint. Similarly, the president has the power to veto laws, has the power to command the armed forces. Right? So these are powers that are explicitly stated. Concurrent powers provide some confusion whenever we're looking at our federal system, federal meaning the term federalism. Remember I said that even though it doesn't seem like it, it is the case that the state governments and the national government there's no hierarchy there. They're both equal, all right? Right? But there are some powers that both of them share. Both the state government and the national government can tax, right? Now, when these laws are being made within these concurrent powers, there has to be some sort of referee, which is the United States Supreme Court. And of course, the U.S. Constitution gave a here's a kind of a catch-all, or here's the caveat, so that concurrent powers don't confuse too much. Let's just say that if there are 2 laws that conflict, then the federal government wins. All right, and then finally we have implied powers. Implied. Think about what the term implied means. It means, I was going to say it means tacit, but some of you may not know what tacit means either. But the point is, implied means that there are powers that the national government or the federal government have that are not specifically stated in the Constitution, but because they have one enumerated power, there's kind of an implication of enumerated power that another power is necessary in order to complete or take action on the enumerated power. So here's what we mean by that. And by we, I mean, hang with me. By we, I mean the founders. So the necessary and proper clause is an example of an implied power, or rather, where we get the term implied power. The necessary and proper clause says that Congress has the power to make laws that are necessary and proper for carrying into execution all of these powers. So, Congress has the power to coin money. So then there's an implication that Congress has the power to build and fund a U.S. mint. So there are implications with certain powers that the president, that Congress, that the Supreme Court has, and even if they're not specifically stated, they're often implied. Now, when we're looking at how much power does the government have, this is where things get really messy, is with the implied powers. I mean, how far can implied powers take us? Really, really far. And we're going to see that, it's possible that if the federal government wanted to mandate that everybody eats broccoli for dinner, and for breakfast, and for lunch, every day, no matter what, there's kind of an implication in there that they can do that. We'll talk more about that later. Let's move on. All right, let's go back here. So the next few slides, the Commerce Clause, the Necessary and Proper Clause, the Supremacy Clause, the 10th Amendment, all very important parts of the Constitution. And they're important to the overall institutional design. These are going to come up again and again. And so in addition to, all of these. So go back through them, look at them, and then they're going to come back again as we go through the remainder of the semester. Now, let's talk a little bit about some of the theories that the founders had as they were going through creating this Constitution. We don't know exactly what the founders were thinking whenever they were, or the delegates were thinking whenever they were creating the Constitution, but we kind of have a lot to go on. We can't read their minds, but we have writings. By the way, the convention was not public. They wouldn't let reporters in. They did everything in secret. Although there was one individual delegate who took very fastidious notes, William Maclay, and Madison took notes too, but they weren't supposed to be made public. William Maclay had every intention of doing that. At any rate, once the Constitution was written and they needed it ratified, I think I mentioned that there were some states that were really hesitant to ratify the Constitution. They had a lot of issues with it. Aside from the fact that the convention never was intended to rewrite the government constitution anyway. In order to assuage these issues that some of these states had, those who really supported this new form of government, we call them the Federalists. Those who supported the 1787 Constitution, referred to as the Federalist. Those who wanted hoped that they would go back to the Articles of Confederation, but with amendments, those were known as the Anti-Federalists. But the Federalists, those who supported it, wrote articles written under pseudonyms to newspapers of the states, that specifically New York. So you've probably heard of the Federalist Papers, and that's where we get this. So the Federalist Papers were written specifically to convince New York, the governor of New York, to ratify the Constitution. They were addressing certain issues. They were identifying some things that they knew that the states had issues with, and they were trying to answer those questions and assuage those concerns. Simultaneously, the Anti-Federalists were also publishing papers too in those newspapers, and they were trying to urge these states to not give up their state rights, their individual rights, and to prefer a decentralized federal government, one that didn't have as much power as the central government did under the 1787 Constitution. Now, it's important that when you look at the Federalist Papers, you understand that they are propaganda. Yeah, they are. The Federalist Papers were written with one purpose and one purpose only: to convince somebody of their idea. And it was written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and one or two were written by John Jay. He got sick and didn't get to write anymore. But there's two Federalist Papers, number 10 and 51, that keep coming up again and again. And I want you to read them, but for right now, um, I want to kind of highlight some of the biggest complaints. Um, and in Federalist Number 10, it was written by Madison, um, one of the biggest complaints was that the United States was far too big to be to have one central government, right? That there would just be tons of factions, factions that would tyrannize smaller factions. A faction is a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority. They're united in one interest, and that interest is adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the aggregate interest of the community. And so Madison was trying to convince here in Federalist Number 10 that factions aren't going to be a problem in government. That because there would be so many factions, it would essentially, there would be so much push and pull between all of the factions that the result would be that only the common good would come out of it. Now, I am paraphrasing Federalist 10 quite a bit here. And he goes through and talks about the way that he lists or describes the argument, or describes his argument here is it's not unique, but it's pretty slick. He says, there's always going to be factions, right? There is. And like I said in the discussion board for this week, or I guess last week, it's part of our nature to divide up into, oh, well, I have a lot in common with this person, or I have a lot in common with another person. And then we just kind of divide up into teams or groups, right? It's part of human nature, thus Republicans and Democrats. So he goes through and says, all right, so there's always going to be factions. So here's what we can do. We can remove the causes of factions, which would mean authoritarianism. So get rid of all liberty, remove liberty, and you remove the ability for people to create factions. But that sounds really bad, and there the cure is even worse than the disease. Then Madison says, we could give everybody the same opinions, conformism, but that's as impractical as the first would be unwise. So as long as the reason of man continues fallible and he is at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. This is the slide that I'm reading from right now. So he argues that in creating the United States to be a republic, not a confederation, but a republic, that it would actually help control the effects of factions. How will it do that? He refers to it as, and you'll continue to hear this, extending the sphere. Create opportunities for so many factions to try to influence government, and the result will be that everybody gets a seat at the table and only the best ideas will emerge. Unworthy candidates will not succeed in achieving power in the legislature if we extend the sphere. You take in the greater interest in opinions to diminish the tyranny of the majority. This is a win-win. So Federalist Number 10, bottom line, all about preventing factions. Federalist 51, as I mentioned, is the second. It's probably more quoted than Federalist Number 10, but they're both equally important. Federalist 51 discusses a couple things. It discusses what we talked about with the philosophies of Newton and the philosophies of Hume, competition and the idea of balance and force and kind of a fulcrum. Essentially, Madison is arguing, you know what, we can't control who people are going to put into office. Government itself is the greatest of all reflections on human nature. So people are just inherently not good. They're self-interested, and they're going to seek out their self-interest at the expense of others. His reasoning for that, he said, well, if men were angels, then we wouldn't even need government, would we? We could just live in a state of nature and everybody would be kind to each other. But men aren't angels, so government's necessary. So there has to be, yes, we need to elect good people to government, but there has to be necessary controls and other precautions to take place too. So how do we keep government in check? How do we make sure that government's not going to tyrannize? We do it through internal structures. And so it's in Federalist 51 that Madison talks about separation of powers, checks and balances, and federalism. All of these three components help keep the human nature in check. So here he notes that federalism, remember this is the idea that states have sovereignty, the national government has sovereignty. Governance is divided between the states and the national government. And the national government's going to keep the state governments from tyrannizing the citizens, but the states, because they have equal authority, will also have the power to keep the national government from tyrannizing. So there's going to be like a force, like a push-pull between the two to keep the other one in check. So we're not just depending on state government behaving correctly. We're not just depending on the national government behaving correctly. We're depending on both of them to check the other. Secondly, separation of powers. We talked about that. Branches need to be independent of each other so that power doesn't concentrate in just one branch. So they need to be equal, they need to be independent. Checks and balances is taking what he knows about human nature, or what we know about human nature, which is we're self-interested and we're ambitious. And you've probably heard the old adage, it's not really an adage, I forget who said it, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think I said it incorrectly, but you get the picture. That even if the best person gets into government, they might be corrupted by the amount of power that they have. So Madison says, this form of government, this republic actually helps that. Within the institution itself, there are checks and balances. Basically, we're taking the ambition of others and we're using that ambition to counteract ambition from others. So everybody's got ambition. And because everybody's got ambition in government, everybody's trying to scratch for that extra power, it'll prevent everyone from getting too much power. Now, has this worked perfectly? No, nothing works perfectly. But for the most part, I think, I'm going to say for the most part, these are great ideas. Now let's assess how they did. And we are going to assess this in a very, in a non-scientific way. This is going to be kind of broad, a little anecdotal, but bear with me here. How did our founders do? Well, first of all, we know that our founders weren't perfect people. But we also know that our founders had experience. They'd already failed with one government. Our founders had at their disposal generations of people of political philosophers that had an idea of what good government should be, and they took the best of those principles and tried to apply them. But how did they do? Well, one of the components of a well-written constitution is how stable is it, right? How stable is the Constitution? Did it last? And it's lasted. Now, so we've had relatively stable nation. The institutions have, now the institutions have changed, but they've changed within the confines of the institution. But we also know, and your authors talk about this polarization and gridlock that results from it in Congress, that stops government from doing some things that a lot of citizens really want them to do. Sometimes the policy that they have is not good enough yet. Sometimes they can't agree on it. Sometimes you have different people in Congress that are at complete odds of what kind of policy is best. But the nation has gotten very polarized, and that's certainly hindered. And our Constitution allows for polarization because it allows for individuals to have an opinion and a say about government. So is that bad that we're polarized? I don't think it's great. Is it a symptom of the freedom that we have? Yeah, I think so. Anyway, so the next bullet point. Other nations use the U.S. Constitution as an example, as a framework, as a guideline. They add to it. Mostly they just add to it, but the basic framework other nations are using. that's a good sign. Iceland, I think, I want to say 10 years ago, were redoing their constitution. Who did they look at? They looked at the US Constitution. New emerging democracies that are um, um, fleeing or establishing themselves outside of a previous dictator, they're looking at the US Constitution. Now, the US Constitution isn't right for everybody, but that general framework, popular sovereignty, separation of powers, checks and balances, those components say things about human nature. And I think it's applicable to a lot of cultures. Finally, amendments are really hard to enact, and this is a good thing because it also means that it maintains our stability, and it means that the nation can't be immediately harmed, or that the state of the nation is not at the whim of like a fleeting public opinion, right? And public opinions are fleeting. Finally, competing principles, well, not finally, but I think four, competing principles within our institution, liberty, equality, both things we really want, but both things conflict. These competing principles, it means that someone is always unhappy with the state of government. So is that good? No, it's not good. Optimally, everybody would be really happy with how government is treating them and the opportunities and the way government is being administered. But because there are competing principles and because we all have individual preferences of what's most important, and by that, I'll say this, think about somebody who is gung-ho about climate change, and their goal is to really strive for that. That's going to be, for some people out there, that's their concern. That's it. That's their issue. Right, and but if you're looking at climate change and putting every resource we have to addressing it, it means that we'll have to sometimes, and some people say it means that we may have to let up on some other priorities that we have. I mean, is national defense still a priority? I think it always is to some extent, but how much of that should we give up to do some of the other things that we want to do? Basically, again, policy choices means that somebody will lose, not everybody wins. That's just the name of the game. And I'll also say this too. The Constitution itself and how it's framed up creates an opportunity for there to be a consistent push and pull between different sides, between these different factions. And ultimately, that's been a good thing for the nation. When we see a push and pull, when we see somebody challenging the other person's views, hopefully what comes of that is, us getting closer to, the common good, or what is good government. And so push and pull is really, really important. And, to give you an example of that, let me talk a little bit about Antonin Scalia. Antonin Scalia passed away, I think, 3 years ago. And he was very well known because he dissented in almost every Supreme Court decision while he was on the Supreme Court. However the Supreme Court ruled, he would usually dissent in some way. So I actually have a mug that has his face on it, and it just says, "I dissent," in big exclamation point capital letters. He seemed really rigid, really unmovable, very principled, and like I said, unwilling to move on his opinions and ideas about government. He was very conservative. Now, ironically, he was also really good friends with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who is very left-leaning. They were best friends. And it was clear that, and why did I bring up Ruth Bader Ginsburg? I'm not really sure, except to say that while Scalia appeared to be very immovable, very staunch, he saw his place on the Supreme Court as kind of that he wanted to challenge anytime the nation made a change. he wanted to be the one to challenge it, to make sure that the nation wasn't going in a wrong direction, to make sure that people were sure that his fellow justices were sure that they wanted to go in that direction. Now, he never said that explicitly, but he kind of implied it. That Scalia was all about, being the antithesis of whatever was on the table, and that had an important role. And different views, different ideas, especially in something as complicated and as policy making. Not that the Supreme Court makes policy, but they kind of do. But something as complicated as policymaking, where we don't know the right answer or how to, we may know where we want to get, but we don't know how to get there, So in something that complicated, it's necessary to push back and to really challenge each other in those things. So that's the lecture here for chapter 2. I know it was longer than usual, but I do want to point out that I have posted on Blackboard, sorry, an article written by James Madison that talks about the deficiencies of the Articles of Confederation. Separation of powers, checks and balances, seems to sometimes confuse my students. So I have put a link to a crash course with separation of powers and checks and balances. It's really quick. It's a really good explanation of it. If you're a little confused, they just explain it in a different way than I did, and they explain it in a different way than your authors did, but it's still the same. And then finally, I have also posted on there Professor Davis's abridged guide to the U.S. Constitution. So let me also end up saying that be sure and look at the deadlines for this week. In addition to that, if you're having any trouble completing your assignments or any trouble at all with this course, and you're not making the grade, or you're afraid you're not going to make the grade you want to make, talk to me and let me see if I can help you. Whether it's helping you study better, whether it's helping you, the worst I can say is, oh my gosh, I can't help. That's the worst. And at which point I'll say, I'm really sorry I can't help. So talk to me, send me an email, we'll Zoom maybe, or maybe even a phone call. You guys have a great week, and I'll see you next time.